We Are Satellites by Sarah Pinsker. This is a family drama novel with a science fiction backdrop. I really like the book. It's a good, interesting story about family dynamics. It has some interesting commentary about the near future with regards to science fiction, of what brain implants could be like in the near future. It's a new take on brain implants where it allows people to multitask more effectively, which is actually kind of interesting because I never thought of brain implants focusing on something like that instead of just trying to increase your inherent smartness or capabilities to do things. Some things that I didn't like about the story, the pacing was a big drag. There's two main parts in this book, like a part one and a part two, and part one could have really been cut down, I think. Part one basically was half of the book, like a good 200 pages, and it probably could have be cut down by like half, and not a lot would have been lost because the fractious relationships and family drama develop in part two. A lot of the setup isn't actually there in part one. While parts of part one are important in detailing like some of the context of what happens in part two, some of the backstory of like why people did certain actions, the actual relationships at the start of part two weren't really actually different from like what they were at the start of part one, and they weren't really affected by the actions of part one. So with that in mind, it really felt like part one was kind of a drag because nothing much happened. There wasn't even that much drama per se in part one. The ending is a nice ending too. I like, it's a nice feel-good ending. I don't think it does anything super dramatic and super crazy, but I don't think it has to. I think it was a nice way to wrap up and basically tie a bow on the entire story and give a good resolution to all the characters. I'm going to elaborate more on what I said about the first half of the book feeling really redundant. So really what happened in first half? I think the first half, for sure, the book focused a lot more on Val than it did on Julie. So, I mean, Val and Julie, the two mothers in this relationship, in the family. Like, it focused more on Val because I think it's building on, as these people were starting to get their pilots, Val was the one who resisted it, right? So the first part of the story focused a lot more on her and the struggles that she had with accepting that both her kid and her wife were getting these pilots. So like the main big blow up event in part one was when she got really mad at the recruiter at the school, and she was dressed in that costume, and then basically she actually got let go of her job from that because later on in the story it was said that that is what happened to actually get her fired from her job, right? So that's like the main plot thing that happens, but really I think at the end of part one she kind of comes to accept it. Like, she doesn't fully accept it, and but like she's on good relations with all the people at the start of at the end of part one. Like, she still has a good relationship with Sophie. She and Julie don't really have any troubling issues, and David, I mean, they can't really accept that he goes to the military because they want him to be safe, but it's not like they had a really nasty falling apart, right? They just want to wish him the best. He went to the military, and then you can see at the start of part two, when he actually comes back to the military, they're all really happy and glad that he's come home safe. So at the end of part one, I think this is why I was saying it felt like a lot of it probably could have been cut. Part one doesn't actually do much to develop or even really examine the family relationships, because they're the only kind of drama and like conflict and friction between family members it looks at is Val and Julie a little bit when Julie's trying to get the pilot, but it's not that intense at all, and they resolve it in a very adult fashion. Also, when Val and Julie are kind of conflicted about letting David get the pilot, there's the big back and forth, but eventually Val like comes through, and she's more concerned about like what it will do to David. But I mean, there's never any big blow up, right? And then Sophie, it's cool to see things from her perspective, and we actually get some important context for then who she becomes in part 2, with her going to the rally and meeting Gabe. But like her relationship with her parents and with her brother, like nothing really changes. Nothing is really like dramatized. There's really no conflict with her. So I would say part 1, it really felt like it's a context building and a very background foundation part of the book, right? For then explaining what happens in part 2. So that's why I think it affects the pacing. It didn't feel like in regards with the plot, a lot is happening, because it's just building the seeds for then what happens in part 2. Julie and Val, they seem like they're interesting characters, and in fact we like follow them mostly in part 1, their POVs, and in part 2 with Julie as well. But it really feels like those two characters don't have a lot of agency. It's kind of, especially in part 2, it's like how they're reacting to the stuff that Sophie and David do, which I guess makes sense because, you know, they're like adults and it's not like they're leading super interesting lives. But it really felt like they're not initiating parts of it, which, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I really like how the whole David arc played out in part 2, because everything felt very believable, right? In part 1, he didn't want to fall behind. That's why he got the pilot. He got the noise complaints. He tried to tell the doctors. They didn't believe him. Or actually, it was all a cover-up, but yeah, they didn't believe him. And then in part 2, it explains why he wants to go to the military, because then maybe he can learn how to better train it. And then at the start of part 2, he comes back. We learn that it actually hasn't like gotten better at all. And all of this buildup of how much the noise has been affecting him, it makes sense then why he started to then look for the drug quiet, because it's really like the only escape that he can have. And with all that motivation, it then makes sense how he kept spiraling. And besides just the drug arc, I thought it was really great what the book did with describing how the actions of David actually affected a lot of the people beside him. So there's clearly the conflict that he has with Julie and his parents, who just want him to be better, and the stuff with his sister. But I thought the most interesting part was actually when he was staying over at Milo's house with, is it Karina? I think Milo's girlfriend. And basically him just being, it's both a combination of him being a drug addict and also like not being employable with his pilot, right? Those two things just made it so hard for him to move on, and he spiraled into just finding solace in the drug. And then you can see how this affected, like, I think that chapter where he throws the drugs away and then he gets stuck in the train, but it all happens from him actually starting in the apartment, and Karina being like clearly showing in implicit but kind of explicit ways that she's unhappy with him being around here. It shows how addiction can affect even the people that aren't even your family or even interact with you a lot but are still somewhat in your life, which I thought was really nice. One of the things I really appreciate about this book is it does not make a big deal of some more modern social topics, specifically gay marriage, and they just have it that it's something accepted. And I think that is really important. Having these strong gay couples and relationships described in books, and not being super explicit about drawing attention to this. It's just like, that is not what's important in this story. And I think that's okay. And in fact, I think that elevates the aspect that it's gay. It's just a normal, accepted thing for this family in this world. And that's how it should be in this world as well. We shouldn't be making a huge deal about it. It should just be normal, because that should be. Gay people should just feel normal. They shouldn't have to feel different from straight people, right? And I think the book did a really good job at this. They have these two mothers, and we focus on them as people and their relationships with their children, not the fact that they're gay. So I think the book did that really well. Plot, 4.5 out of 5. Pacing, 3 out of 5. Ending, 3.5 out of 5. Characters, 4.5 out of 5. Rating, 4 out of 5.